All right, let's pick up and get some reaction to what the President has just said at the end of that ANC Lekgotla, that there's broad agreement within the ANC that a state of national disaster now needs to be declared over our energy crisis. I'm joined now by Professor Mark Swilling from the University of Stellenbosch, and Prof Swilling, of course, is also part of the National Planning Committee. Prof, thank you very much for joining us. It was sometime last year that the National Planning Commission was suggesting, in fact, a state of disaster over the energy crisis. Just take me back to the reasoning behind that and what a state of disaster would actually do to help this problem.
Well, the National Planning Commission referred to a national state of emergency, but in the subsequent conversations, we weren't defining that with a capital E. It was really just registering that we have an emergency situation and special measures are required. So a national disaster legally is probably a more friendly instrument to use than a state of emergency. But the rationale was very clear and remains even more urgent than ever before, which is using the normal procurement procedures, which takes several months for Eskom to procure the kinds of spares that are required to repair the electricity generation machines, just takes too long and needs to be circumvented. And so that's really the point of a national state of disaster, and it's a good thing. It needs to happen. Obviously, there are lots and lots of dangers, as we saw during COVID, which is circumventing normal procurement procedures opens the door for corruption. But if that can be managed appropriately, then what we are looking at is much quicker solutions to the breakdown of the electricity generation machines, and every South African should celebrate that.
So you're definitely pleased to see that the ANC is in broad agreement, but also the President mentioning that they still need to check the legal framework to see if what we're experiencing qualifies as a national disaster. I mean, I can't think why it wouldn't, but do you have any more details on what bar we have to reach before we declare a disaster?
Well, he was in favor of these kinds of special measures back in July, but was advised legally that both a state of emergency and a state of disaster were inappropriate for what needed to be achieved. And so I think that's what is being referred to, is that there's some clever footwork, some legal technicalities that are going to have to be sorted out. And it probably might mean rushing through some special legislation through Parliament. But I'm not sure. I'm not well informed enough or close enough to what's going on to say more than that.
Despite the dangers, and we all know that when there's an emergency or there's a disaster, government, everyone is trying to act more quickly. That's the entire point of what the President wants to do now. But that also means that the eyes and the monitoring is not always as efficient and as steady as it should be. Do you think even despite those risks, we've got to go this route?
You know, for me, South Africa is actually almost in a state of war. It's you know, under what conditions would one invoke war measures to overcome the normal ways of doing business, which would be inappropriate for fighting a war? We're in a very similar situation, in my view. We are facing a very, very, very serious disaster, much worse than many people predicted. I mean, Andre de Ruyter, what was it, towards the end of 2020, was saying, if we don't act quickly, we're looking at permanent load shedding by 2024, 2025. Well, it's 2023. Mm-hmm. It's much worse than everybody predicted. So come on, let's act. Let's have emergency measures that will make it possible to circumvent the normal procedures. And there's nothing wrong with those normal procedures, but these are not normal times. And so they are inapplicable. They just get in the way of very fast procurement of the spares and equipment that Eskom needs in order to fix the machines.
Does it also open up more money? I know that when the floods happened in KwaZulu-Natal, part of declaring a disaster also can mean that there's a process where there's a kitty for disaster. Could that also mean more money?
It may allow for the kinds of emergency procurement that may be appropriate. For example, there's talk of the car power ships coming back into the game. Well, if this is going to be used to engineer 20-year power purchase agreements for car power ships, that'll be a travesty. That'll be a real problem. But 3 to 5 years is probably not a bad idea for some emergency supply by car power ships. Emergency interventions in the diesel situation might also be appropriate. And there's even discussion of for example, the smelters being closed, which would eliminate one stage. So if you bring in diesels, 2 stages. If you bring in car power ships, maybe a stage. You close I'm not suggesting that, but if you did close the smelters, that's another stage. If you had the spares to fix the machines more rapidly, that might be a stage or 2. And we're starting to get closer and closer to normality. If that is all in parallel with a rapid escalation of renewables build in order to create more space for Eskom to take machines off the grid to fix them properly, then within 2 years, as the National Planning Commission argued, we could actually be through this load shedding nightmare.
It was interesting to note in the President's weekly newsletter, he said that we should soon be able to announce something in the way of assistance or incentives for homes and small businesses who want to make use of alternative power. What should that look like?
Yeah.
I mean, do you think it should be a subsidy? Do you have any views on how that could work?
Well, it's often referred to as the Vietnam solution. Vietnam did exactly that under pressure, and within a year there were 9 extra gigs of rooftop generation capacity on the grid. So it can work, and it's probably the fastest way to get more electrons into the system compared to all the others. And basically, what it would mean is simply recognize what is already happening, which is households, businesses, shopping malls, mines are already installing their embedded generation systems. But to enhance that, what you would need is to make it possible for all of those households, businesses, factories, etc., to actually generate a surplus. In other words, more than they need, that then feeds onto the grid. At the moment, that is tricky. So that would be one way in which you would be able to overcome some of the blockages, to just further turbocharging this embedded generation movement that is already underway as people just get fed up and work out their own solution. But you will need to subsidize smaller businesses and poorer households. But there are quite a number of projects. I've been involved in one of them called the iShack, which uses the free basic electricity allocation to actually finance the provision of solar and informal settlements. So across the board, from the poorest to the richest, this embedded generation solution can work. But for smaller businesses and poorer households, you might need a bit more of a subsidy, equivalent to the housing subsidy.
It sounds really like we would be moving in the right direction. Thank you so much for speaking to us, Professor Mark Swilling. Always a pleasure, from the University of Stellenbosch, and of course also part of the National Planning Commission. Do stay with